Hello, horror addicts. I'm Kristin Battestella, aka Kbatz, and tonight I actually want to talk about Shakespeare. Yes, Shakespeare and horror, believe it or not, is not a new topic. If you may recall, way back, it feels like it was a decade ago, but back in February, we actually ended up having an interesting conversation about Shakespeare and horror at our horroraddicts.net online writers conference. I don't blame you if you don't remember it. I barely remember it. This year, I really remember the conference being very frustrating, actually. It was right at the beginning of all our pandemic horrors, of course, and there were a lot of hits and links and ratings, and the statistics were really great for the conference week, but our interaction was low. We didn't have a lot of people commenting and sharing and getting involved, so it was kind of a mixed logistics, maybe just crazy times, but the information is still there to go back and look at as well. And everything that that I would like to talk about here tonight, um, I don't think I've actually done any Shakespeare posts at horroraddicts.net, but they're available on my regular film blog, I Think, Therefore I Review. And, I know maybe it's a heavy time to talk about Shakespeare. Being in a lot of writers' groups, I've seen several of those nice memes and funny jokes of like, William Shakespeare wrote King Lear during the plague. Be like Bill. No, no, can't do that. Sorry, brain cannot function. And I don't think Shakespeare is something that's elitist or kind of top drawer, highbrow, high concept all the time. But I think in our society, maybe it's America, or maybe it was the way school was when I was taught. It was very, I don't know, it is high concept, or it's up here and you have to be smart enough to comprehend it. And I think maybe that's even in our cultural lexicon. When a movie is just a casual, lighthearted comedy film, its justification is that's okay because, well, it's not Shakespeare. It's not supposed to be Shakespeare. It's okay. So I think maybe we have this sort of lofty kind of ideology with Shakespeare, and that's not always necessarily the case. You know, um, you know, they are giant, giant, heavy tomb books. I had three separate editions of this big giant book when I was a kid. They were heavy. That was the most difficult part for me when I was a kid, that they were too heavy for me to carry. But I absolutely loved this record, of course. I mean, look at that scandalous cover. You're not going to be able to keep that away from the kid. I love this Henry Mancini music, and God, this is so old and delicate. It's falling apart. And I had this little book here that went along with the movie, and it had all the different pictures and the script in it. I loved this. So this is the 1968 film, obviously, which I have written about at I Think Therefore I Review. And I guess Romeo and Juliet, maybe more so the Leonardo DiCaprio Claire Danes version today, is more of a gateway kind of for kids. But when I was in school, and we had to read Shakespeare out loud. Now, maybe it's changed, maybe it hasn't, but to me, I would have really loved if the curriculum just allowed for Shakespeare being an elective. And then if you wanted to take it, you could take it. And be in an auditorium, be able to stand up and read and perform. It's a play. But the way my school designed it, where every year, each semester, you had to stop and break for Shakespeare. It didn't matter what you were doing. So it was very difficult to be 14 years old and having to sit in a desk and I've already loved Romeo and Juliet, and then have obnoxious little boys be like, draw thy sword, not being able to handle it. And it was very frustrating, very annoying. And one year we were in American literature, and I hate the Scarlet Letter. I hate all the Puritan stuff that we were doing. And I was so excited that we had to stop because it was Shakespeare time and we were going to do Julius Caesar, which I enjoy. I love Julius Caesar very much. It's one of my three favorites. I kind of waver between Julius Caesar, Othello, and Macbeth. I'll talk about all of them a little bit. And I was very excited about Julius Caesar. I love just the Roman history aspects of it as well. And I remember being so excited when we finished Julius Caesar because I said to the teacher, I said, oh, we're going to do Antony and Cleopatra next, right? And she's like, oh, no, we're going back to Nathaniel Hawthorne and the Puritans. And I remember being so upset and so angry. And one year we just had to choose a sonnet and memorize it. And, you know, another year, it was my final year, it was my senior year. The only class I had required was English, and it was British literature. And I thought, this is great. I've already read everything. You know, I loved, you know, when we finally got up to Frankenstein, and we had a condensed version of Macbeth. It was British literature, and they said we didn't have enough time to get into Shakespeare. We're just going to spend a few weeks here on the shortened version of Macbeth. And I was so angry that I actually lugged one of my giant, heavy, complete tragedies books with Macbeth in it. I'm going to keep saying Macbeth, not the Scottish play. Sorry, thespian theater folks, but I was so angry. And then we didn't get to do Charles Dickens in that British class either because we just ran out of time. And it just really brought me into such a love-hate relationship with Shakespeare, because I just thought that school presents it as something painful or, I don't know, frustrating or high concept or complicated. And it doesn't have to be that way. And it's really interesting because the way our schools kind of do it backwards kind of take out some of the enjoyment of it. And, you know, Hamlet, Julius Caesar, there are ghosts that make appearances. You know, there are a couple other plays where ghosts just randomly pop up in the play. And when you're reading it today, sometimes that feels very unusual, of like, how contrived. You know, oh, he gets information from a ghost, or something happens in a dream. You know, we're reading something that is fairly historical and having, you know, famous quotes in it, Veni Vidi Vici, and all of a sudden there's a ghost. Like, what? You know, I think it might be jarring for modern audiences, but then at the same time, we have to think about the audience when Shakespeare was writing. Now, he was contemporaneous with John Dee in the Elizabethan court, and later in King James when all the witch trials were going on. So Shakespeare had an audience who was quite aware of kind of ghosts and magic and mystical things. And maybe this is more of a dark fantasy per se than horror, but we come out of this kind of Tolkien type of fantasy where it has to be some other kind of mystical, kind of enchanted realm, or sometime in the past, as opposed to something maybe the Victorians or earlier, where it was very much fantasy is just beyond the hedge. It's in the next realm. It sort of walks alongside of us. You know, and that was very, very active in Shakespeare's time of, you know, witches, the witches in Macbeth. Obviously, people believed in these kind of crazy things. And that idea of like where we get Halloween, the Samhain, that there's certain times of year or certain times and places where the veils between two worlds can lift, and that's actually a very thin veil, and there's the fairies to worry about, or the woes, or things like that. So his audience would not be surprised by having supernatural elements even in a fairly straightforward play. And we've lost that. Similar to the jokes during Crimson Peak, which I spoke about during the Gothic romance video, where it's not a ghost story. We tend to think, oh, that there's ghosts, there's always supposed to be something scary or fantastic. It's not a ghost story, it's a story that happens to have ghosts in it. And Shakespeare's audience was aware of that. And at the same time, it's a play. And he does have an audience who's sitting in probably, you know, some uncomfortable staging, or this was their only entertainment. There had to be some sort of spectacle or some sort of moment of excitement. And usually that's where the ghost makes the appearance. So that's one of the random kind of fun things that I love about Julius Caesar. And Julie Taymor, actually, the director, did an adaptation of The Tempest several years ago with Helen Mirren. Actually, instead of a Prospero, there's a Prospera. And there's pieces, maybe not, that actually Shakespeare based this on John Dee, but it has all this different sorcery and wizardry and fantasy and kind of surreal elements, and, you know, all the shipwrecks and all this fun kind of turbulence. And it's ironic that Shakespeare obviously wrote about fathers and sons. He wrote about mothers and sons, and he wrote about fathers and daughters, but he didn't really write that much about mothers and daughters. So when you have a female Prospera that's, you know, having this fanciful island, you know, there to shield and protect her daughter from the outside world, it lends itself to a different dynamic. So there's been a lot of different recent adaptations of Shakespeare, obviously, that have taken things in different ways. I may have mentioned actually a while ago in the summer horror, gothic horror reading video that I did. You can go back and watch that. And everything, again, that I'm speaking about today, I will also have all the different information and links in the descriptions as well. So you can subscribe and go back and look for that information. I spoke about Macbeth several times, the 2015 version with Michael Fassbender and Marion Cotillard. My French is bad, I'm sorry. Her inspired casting and the way they added perhaps a baby lost kind of dynamic to the couple Macbeth. Maybe that's where a lot of their problems stem from, and that it would not have been unheard of to have a French woman with the different alliances between France and Scotland at the time. Um, and there's a little bit of a not post-apocalyptic, but a very wartime, eerie kind of feeling to it. And this debate about maybe Macbeth having kind of a PTSD kind of, he's too wrapped up in his head, over, wartime kind of power struggles, and she is stuck at home with, there's something wrong with me because I had a dead baby. There's some interesting things that should be happening in this Macbeth, but it doesn't really seem to go far enough. It looks the period, and it also has different surreal lighting and smoke. The battles are well done, but it feels like it's very kind of at arm's length. It doesn't feel like it really gets inside Macbeth's head, which if you're going to make some kind of wartime rage PTSD, it's like, well, then do that. Let's go for it. Let's see it. And it's kind of, I don't know, it felt very kind of stilted. There are other people who swear by it. They love it. They thought it was really drastically different and a really great approach. But I felt that it was a little bit of a letdown, especially in comparison to the 2010 television presentation of Macbeth starring Patrick Stewart. This one won a lot of awards, and I feel like I'm going to keep using the word surreal a lot, but this one I actually want to say it was very, very hellish. It's Patrick Stewart is older than what Macbeth is usually cast as, and actually there's even an older 60s black and white version with a very young Sean Connery, which is kind of strange to see Sean Connery as a very young Macbeth. But which that one's a lot of fun. It's of its time because of its television kind of trappings, but the Patrick Stewart one, maybe you would not know, was a television production. It has a lot of great values, and he's older. Maybe he's been passed over for power, and Kate Fleetwood is his wife, is Lady Macbeth in it, and they use symbolic kind of greens for the jealousy, and it's very 40s looking in a way. It looks fascist, honestly, and there's very, again, post-war kind of effects, and it has a very industrial look to it, and there's an elevator that goes up and down, symbolic of the kind of hellish kind of levels of the floor, and there's some very creepy, the witches are kind of wartime nurses, and so there's a lot of very disturbing kind of creepy kind of imagery, and that one really, I think, does capture the sort of state of mind of these people who are really really kind of messed up. I love that Romeo and Juliet record when I was younger, and I had another record set. It came from these kind of book volumes that back in the day there used to be these different kind of collector volume sets where you would get a bunch of the books all together, and they actually had records with them. And back in that day, a lot of the records that I had were old, or the new ones that my sister and I got, we tended to scratch up very quickly or break when we were fighting with each other. And when I was going through that set again, I said, well, gee, I wonder what kind of Shakespeare excerpts are on these records. And it had the Lady Macbeth's soliloquy with the poison in her bosom, and very twisted and warped, and it was broad daylight, and I was sitting listening to this record, and it was very crisp and very clean because it wasn't a record that I had repeatedly played and destroyed, and it was just her voice, and it was as if she was whispering in my ear, and it really sent chills up my spine. It was just because it's just such great demented material, and just even that kind of horror that Shakespeare actually in weird ways addresses lots of things that maybe we've forgotten today, that he kind of looks back, that it's the woman wears the pants in that family, which was, surprising at the time, and Shakespeare writes a lot about women who have to have power through their nearest sort of male relation. And I have there's two different versions of this Coriolanus. This is the film version that Ray Fiennes stars and directs as well. Um, and it takes place in sort of modern design at like in Bosnia, Serbia is kind of where they filmed it. So they retained that kind of Roman wartime esque sort of situation, but in a contemporary setting, and they still speak the Shakespeare language. And Coriolanus is another one where it's his mother's demented influence on wanting to see him lead Rome, and it does not work out. It goes terribly. And I think this one is very interesting. And there's also a 2014 play version. It's actually available this week on the National Theater at Home on their YouTube. So when you're done watching all my videos, you can go watch their YouTube, kind of bonus. That one has Tom Hiddleston in it, and it's very bloody, and it's a stage presentation. I was fortunate enough to see it on one of its encores in theater. I saw it at the Princeton Garden Theater, and it's really fascinating because it's a small stage production, and yet it keeps getting further and further and further and further boxed in. And I spent at length writing about both of these films and comparing them because, again, there's a lot of blood, there's a lot of sort of wartime aspects and politics in them, and they're actually still very relevant today. And it's quite interesting how I had to kind of begin, trying to explain the time and place for Julius Caesar. And it's really kind of fascinating that we are still looking to Shakespeare 500 years ago to explain things now. And Shakespeare, spent some time writing about sort of Roman plays that took place 500 years before. So it's interesting the way we kind of keep looking back at histories. And there's also if we're talking about kind of wartime and sort of pseudo-fascist kind of pieces, Patrick Stewart in his Macbeth, Ian McKellen actually did a Richard III, which is also a sort of pseudo-fascist. I would almost describe it as if World War One never happened, and sort of that aristocracy sort of continued to Nazism anyway. And that one is very telling. I know I'm getting kind of sidetracked, but it's interesting to look at some of these ones that do different things have sort of commentary on contemporary politics, because let's be honest, I mean, we're living in scary times, and it's kind of strange. Sometimes you want to watch a scary movie to forget all the real world things that are happening, but then other times, we're looking for answers in some of our literature and our adaptations. So there's a lot of great Shakespeare to refer to. I also love there's an Othello version with Lawrence Fishburne and Kenneth Branagh. It's old now, and I remember arguing with my sister for years. She was an English teacher, because on her curriculum it was always just standard to teach Hamlet. And I would say to her, the area where I come from, she worked at an alternative school, that had a lot of mixed minority students that were in, local gangs. And I said, they're not going to care about, the Danish prince getting revenge for his dead dad. Who cares? And I used to say to her, why can't you teach Othello? That is something that it's amazing how relatable it still is. The Hollow Crown here actually is another one that I wrote about in detail. There's been a couple different versions, a second series of this as well. I wish they did a third series on the Roman plays again, but these were television movie productions that, again, I think also sort of, I don't know, they don't seem so lofty or high concept. I mean, again, it's difficult to watch. When I was a kid, there was the weird Mel Gibson Hamlet, and then there was the Kenneth Branagh Hamlet, but they're like 4 hours long. So this is another one that I think is a good gateway if you have students or kids at home who are maybe interested in Shakespeare. This is something that there are television productions that they streamline and tighten things up, but they're actually relatively faithful, and they're really good productions. I've written about those. Titus Andronicus actually is another one where Titus Andronicus is the name of the play. The film adaptation here is just called Titus. That's another one that we did not read in school. And when this film first came out, wow, I think it might have even been like 2000. Actually, I feel like this is kind of old now. When this first came out, I was so confused, and it was so bizarre, and It's Julie Taymor directed again, and I said, "What is going on in this? These people are speaking Old Speaketh, but they're kind of dressed Old Speaketh, but there's motorcycles and microphones and toys." I'm thinking, what is going on in this show? And then back then, you couldn't just instantly Google something. I had to take my time to look it up, and I learned that it was an intentionally anachronistic piece, and this one actually the music from 300 actually is kind of stolen from this film. It has a very kind of twisted, warped, surreal fantasy kind of mood to it. And again, it's Rome. It's the kind of Rome where let's cut up our enemies' entrails and send them to the mystic to burn on the fire and read for our astrology kind of things. And Anthony Hopkins is Titus the general, and Jessica Lange is the Queen of the Goths, and this is really warped and really twisted. And I actually went back. I did not recall having read Titus Andronicus, which it's a play that's sort of very, very late, and I would go back and watch the movie and pull out the book and just try and read line by line. It's actually quite faithful in the dialogue to Shakespeare, but it's very demented and it's very twisted. And when I would watch this, I would say, why isn't this what we're taught in school when we're learning Shakespeare? Like that, this would be so awesome. It's got blood and gore and twisted things. And I have a friend who's going to have a baby, and she wanted names that began with L. And I was looking up all kinds of nice names and nice name lists and countries and biblical language names and things and Latin. And I was on a list of Shakespeare names. And I thought, oh, Lavinia. Lavinia is such a beautiful name. I care not, I'll tell the world. I love Lavinia. And then thinking about what happens to Lavinia in this play, I thought, no. Can't name a kid Lavinia. Can't name a kid Lavinia. And Aaron the Moor in this is a very fascinating character. He's one of those characters who does really despicable, demented, twisted things. And yet, we don't blame him for what he does, or we understand where he's coming from. He doesn't think that what he's doing is wrong, and it kind of makes sense. And that's, when you get the most frightening villain of all. So, I think Shakespeare was writing about a lot of unique things, and it's kind of a shame that in our ideology, our school or symbolism, we only get, Romeo and Juliet all the time. I actually just recently watched an older Romeo and Juliet with Leslie Howard, who's Ashley Wilkes in Gone with the Wind, if you can picture, and he was old, like in his 30s, 40s, in 1936, playing a teenager, and it comes off completely wrong. And maybe that's another thing too. Sometimes when we see a bad Shakespeare adaptation, it can really ruin things for us. As much as I love Julius Caesar, I don't really think that there's a really super great Julius Caesar version out there. I really don't care for the 50s version with Marlon Brando. And there is, I spent, again, in great detail writing about it, a Julius Caesar and an Anthony and Cleopatra twofold piece that Charlton Heston actually did. But there's some really bad casting in some of them where it just comes off. Some people just can't handle some of the dialogue or the language. It feels very stiff and it feels very wooden. As much as I love his horror and I wish that he would do horror movies, I said before, if he ever was in a Peter Cushing biopic or if they made a Graham Knopf Tarkin movie, I would love to see Tom Hiddleston do more horror movies. But I think his Shakespeare, even if you're a fan of his Loki and all the Marvel kind of comic book kind of films, I really think that his Shakespeare material is actually really, really exceptional. So again, that Coriolanus, and he's in the Hollow Crown as well. And this Titus, if you have a chance to see it, it's really demented and twisted. Some of the other films that I've mentioned just have, spoiler alert, they drink poison and die, or just have a lot of maybe blood and war gore to them. And everybody thinks of Macbeth nowadays, bubble, bubble, toil and trouble, fire, burn, and cauldron bubble, or by the pricking of my thumb, something wicked this way comes. I see those kind of things in, the store at Halloween, some cute country design kind of pillow that says something wicked this way comes, and I see some lady picking it up, and I feel like asking, have you even read Macbeth? Do you know why And again, even that, when you're reading it, sometimes you're kind of like, what is wrong with this dude? He is a Thane. He has enough power. Why is he going to believe this prophecy that these witches provide? But again, you were talking about at a time when witches were something to be feared. Nobody wanted to get hexed the wrong way by a witch, I suppose. Or people feared, being accused of being a witch then. So when Shakespeare is writing things about ghosts or fantasy or horror, he's either pulling from previous history to learn their kind of, morals or learn lessons that they didn't learn. We can still learn something from them, or he's speaking to an audience that is aware of spooky things, just like us, right? So I had a horroraddicts.net online writers conference is where we had a couple different articles and some chat transcripts talking with some professors and some experts, and we ended up having a great Shakespeare and horror conversation. So you can read that. And at our Facebook group and our horroraddicts.net blog and our Twitter is the main Horror Addicts handle is at horroraddicts13. You can find all of our links. And it's been a strange time, I know, to talk about horror. I mean, we already had the plague and the pandemic happening, and it was very difficult to focus on horror when, you can't go outside your door because there's horror happening. And now I'm very glad that we're having, in a weird way, the Black Lives Matter protests are happening now. And on our episode 181 podcast, it's a recent episode. You can hear our horror hostess, Marian Rich, speaking about our thoughts. HorrorAddicts.net has always been a diverse community, and these voices need to be heard. As Em said, maybe we can relate because sometimes we're horror folk. Maybe we're a little different, or we follow the alternative. We don't go with the norm or go with the flow. So we understand maybe what sometimes people go through, but not on this scale. And these voices haven't been heard for a long time. It's very upsetting, to realize that some people look the other way when there are places in not the world, but in our own country, maybe in our own state, maybe nearby that you're not aware of, where persecutions have never stopped, where people have still been content with segregation, or lynchings have never stopped. It's very difficult for some folks to wrap their head around the idea that someone could be punished just for being Black. And unfortunately, we've had different brutality and different violence, that's really brought this to the forefront. And we're with you. HorrorAddicts.net has always had a diverse community, and we're proud of that. And we're always seeking new voices and new people at our Facebook group, at our Twitter, and our website. You can find some of the previous stories and articles that we have from some of, not just African American, but some international folks as well. You can find their voices, you can read their thoughts, and you can go to our submissions page also for different internships and writing and submission calls. So if you have something to say in the horror community, HorrorAddicts.net is a wonderful family, and I'm proud to be part of it. I've been here since 2012, I think, talking about frightening flicks. So we're a great community, and we want everyone to be heard. And even if we're discussing sometimes silly, scary things like Shakespeare,